Hi, I'm Anca from MedRise Studio, and this is the place to be to hear about the latest tech trends in healthcare. Today, we will dive into a topic that has captured imaginations across both tech and healthcare: the physiological interfaces and human-machine connections. You've probably heard of everything from brain-implanted chips to smart glasses that seem capable of reading our thoughts without a word being spoken. But with all the myths and misunderstandings floating around, it's important to separate fact from fiction. So to help us do that, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Vanessa Leung, an expert in digital health and wearable technologies. She is leading the Digital Biomarkers for Wellbeing group at St. Paulton University of Applied Sciences in Austria. Her work covers a wide range from digital biomarkers to physiological interfaces and adaptive extended reality, all in the pursuit of improving patient care through technology. Vanessa, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anca. Thank you for the great introduction.
I'd like to start maybe about talking about your journey a little bit, how you came to work in this field of digital biomarkers and extended reality.
Yes, of course. So I started working in this field through my interest in sensors. So I have a background as a physicist in applied physics, particularly laser physics, and there we worked a lot with photodiodes and photosensors. And over a few years, I kind of transitioned to thinking about optics more generally, and also particularly the human side of it, like how do people respond to optical inputs. So we had a project when I was in the University of Basel in Switzerland. We had a project on eye tracking for to understand how children, how their visual behavior in the classroom could maybe have impacts further down the line in terms of developing myopia or short-sightedness. We did a study in Hong Kong because there in East Asia has some of the highest incidence of myopia in the world. And so it was very difficult back then to understand some of the more long-term trends and particularly behavioral trends which would lead to this condition. And I saw together with my colleague Roman Schmid, I saw a possibility to try to use wearable technology, particularly eye tracking, in order to understand that a bit better. And so that kind of got me into the whole realm of working with physiological signals in general, so eye tracking, but also heart rates and so on. And then eventually also into immersive realities, because there I see a lot of potential for using this kind of technology.
One of your areas of expertise is around physiological interfaces and digital biomarkers for personalized, what we call human computer interaction. That's
Right.
a mouthful. So, can you break down for our audience what this means exactly beyond the hype and the buzzwords, and maybe dispel also some of the misconceptions around it?
Absolutely. So I think physiological interfaces may be a term that perhaps not many people are familiar with. You might be more familiar with neural interfaces. So things like Neuralink, or also I remember that Meta also called the Orion interface a neural interface. Now, neural interfaces are one subset of physiological interfaces. What it means for usually with neural interfaces, we understand that there is, I mean, as the word implies, some connection to the brain. And so either this could be through a implanted chip, as you said, but also through a EEG, so electrodes which are on the skull but not penetrating in any way, so not non-invasively measuring brain signals. But it could also be about the peripheral nervous system, so a little bit further away. Uh, Ultimately, though, the idea is to translate neurological signals into either a response or as sort of data input into a device, or the device itself in therapy can send some kind of input to the brain and kind of get a feedback that way. So that would be neuro interfaces. Physiological interfaces are much wider. They cover anything where your physiology, so things like your heart rate, your skin conductance, your eye movements, and also the motion of your body, your muscles, are somehow that data, that those signals are connecting to a computer. And in most cases, the goal would be that there is some dialogue taking place. So for example, your heart rate increases when you're in a certain training. If maybe we need to make the training less intensive, or maybe even make it more intensive depending on the training goal, but there's some kind of adaptive feedback. And so that's the part I think that's really interesting, because it allows people to, or the to communicate with a computer directly without having to type or speak or consciously make an effort to communicate to the computer.
But it's something that we don't really think about, right? We're not like thinking, I want to communicate this information to a computer. Is that our body reacts in different ways, which are then transformed into data that the computer analyzes, understands things about our way of being, thinking, and acting, and then provides an action in return, right?
Exactly, because you can think of it as you can think of it as compared to a human communicating with another human. So when you sit across from somebody, you don't necessarily get that much information from what someone's saying to you. For example, I would say to you, "Oh yes, Anca, I'm having a brilliant day." But if you see that I'm looking down a lot, my shoulders are hunched, I'm not maintaining eye contact, then that information is probably more useful to you than what I say. And that's backed up by research that our verbal communication, or what we consciously tell people, amounts for only a very, very small portion of the actual communication in general. Body language makes a big difference, for example, which is why, people still prefer most of the time to be on, in person with someone as opposed to online, because of that reason, and online as opposed to writing an email, because there even less gets communicated from these kind of nonverbal languages. So if you think of it this way, now when people communicate with a device, most of the time it is this very narrow communication of I type something in, or I say something. Uh, it's really, I have to consciously decide that this is what I want, and we know that people don't communicate that way, right? We know that people communicate to each other through many a multimodal uh, interface, basically. So we see each other, we hear their voices, and so on. So there's so just basically trying to capture some of that spectrum, the richness of actual communication when we communicate with machines.
And how do you link that? Because part of your work is also looking at digital biomarkers in virtual reality
Mhm.
and augmented reality. How do you work around that? And how do digital biomarkers support the immersiveness and effectiveness of virtual environments?
Right. So digital biomarkers are basically any kind of data that we can collect with a digital technology. So as opposed to traditional biomarkers where, you might have to take a blood test or a urine test, digital biomarkers are not really taking any body fluids or analyzing those. They're really just analyzing data that a sensor can pick up. So for example, your heart rate, or your electrodermal activity, so your skin response, which is correlated with stress, with other physiological conditions. And so the digital biomarkers is that link between the interface. So the interface needs data, and that data would be the digital biomarker data. And what we've been doing is connecting that with immersive technologies, because in an immersive environment, actually, a lot of things are controlled. So if you think about your typical virtual reality session, everything is actually made so that you have certain responses and so on. And so a lot of this can be integrated with data collection, but since, for example, eye tracking is integrated into a lot of headsets, that means you can see what people are looking at within the virtual reality environment, or you can see how their stress is, how their cognitive load is in response to certain experiences in that environment, and then adapt the environment accordingly. So this is very helpful for training, because as we know, we cannot do a one-size-fits-all education system that is known to be not particularly effective. And how can we personalize these immersive trainings? Well, one way is by measuring how the user is responding in real time to that environment and trying to, at least within the session, adapt that environment so that they feel more comfortable or that the training objectives are better achieved.
And so let's talk a bit more about use cases, especially in the medical field, because I know that you've worked with a lot of medical and paramedical professionals. Can you tell us more about these collaborations and the use cases that you've developed?
Absolutely. So we work often with paramedical professionals like emergency, so first responders, because they are, by definition, often in these very, very stressful environments. These environments are sometimes difficult to recreate in real life. Think a three-car traffic accident with multiple people being injured. You cannot recreate that training scenario very easily or very cheaply just in a real life circumstances. And so those kind of situations are perfect for virtual reality because they're at a very low cost. You can have these very complex accidents situations recreated, and they're very immersive, they're very lifelike, and you can have people go into those and then try to adapt that environment in order to make the training more effective. And some things that we're working with, for example, is when a first responder has to make a decisions about who is more injured, who requires the most help. How do they make these decisions? How are they affected by distractions? For example, an ambulance drives by with the sirens blaring. Am I still focused on the patient, or do I sort of involuntarily listen in the radio? Someone's radio is blaring. There's phone calls. People are screaming. They're distressed. How do I deal with all these external stresses? Well, we can measure that on a physiological level and through things like eye tracking, the heart rate variability, and so on, and then understand better how that particular person is responding to the stress and adapt the training accordingly. So that's one use case. Another one is starting a large Horizon Europe project called XR to Resilience. And in this use case, the goal is to create an XR training to increase the resilience of healthcare workers. And this is a very exciting project because it's going to be helping help prevent burnout, for example, among our healthcare workers, and teach them skills which will allow them to deal better with the everyday stresses in their lives, in their professional lives. And also, it's going to be a multi-center study across Europe with a randomized control trial, which means we can really, really test if the virtual reality training is actually helping people. And I think here, digital biomarkers will allow us to track how people are responding to the training within the session, how to make the session more effective, how to maybe personalize the sessions. For you, maybe a great resilience tool could be deep breathing. For me, it could be something else like visualization. We are often maybe not requiring the same tools, and so I think measuring these kind of physiological signals will really help to pinpoint some of these things that maybe even the user is not so aware of themselves, because depending on our level of introspection, we might not always know what stresses us out, what calms us, and so on.
And there's also an interesting aspect of both use cases that you've described is that there's an objective measure of stress and there's the subjective one, which is how do we react to stress? Because we don't all have the same tolerance to stress. And some people might have a very high heart rate, but emotionally feel well, whereas other people are in a different situation. So, how do you measure both aspects?
Absolutely, Anca. So we also did a study at a hospital here in Austria where we compared novices and experts and the way they react to an emergency situation. And we found that from the objective data, so from the heart rate variability, eye tracking data, and so on, there was no great statistical difference between the physiological response of experts and novices to this emergency situation. So these are doctors who have been either very experienced in that particular situation, or doctors who are not so experienced. But what's interesting is that when we ask them to fill out a questionnaire, which analyze their task load. So their stress and so on. The novices rate the level of stress and the level of cognitive load much higher than the experts, even though from a subjective point of view, they have very, very different subjective perception of the situation, even though objectively they have their bodies, let's say, are reacting exactly the same way. And so this points to very interesting ideas about the way we perceive, so metacognition, so the way we think about how we respond to situations and how that maybe affects our resilience. Because I might be as stressed as you, but I think, oh, that was just a normal day in the hospital. That was not just a normal day in the clinic. And you might think, oh, wow, that was completely intolerable, and I'm going to maybe not be able to handle this over a long period of time. So I think that's why it's very important to not just do objective data taking, but also ask for perceptions, because and this is what also we will do in the Accelerator Resilience study, is to have ask for perceived stress, and that might be in the end even more important than what the actual stress is when it comes to predicting resilience.
But is this something that can be integrated into the devices directly? Or is this something that requires sort of a human interface to look at the data from the device and then adapt it to the variability of each individual?
What we often do in our work is to sort of calibrate for each user. So try to find out their baseline of cognitive load, the maximum cognitive load, so that we have a range, let's say, of where these physiological signals run from, from where do they run when someone's at rest to when they are, let's say, by their self-report, highly stressed. And then we kind of know, in that case, for this particular individual, what the profile should look like. So that's one way we can do this. And I think that helps a lot because, of course, there's a huge heterogeneity between people. And that's also what makes making these, say, neural interfaces or physiological interfaces so difficult, because you can't just put a device on someone and it works. You really probably usually would need to do some kind of calibration in order to have the range of signals that can be then fed into an algorithm to understand, okay, usually when someone has a heart rate of 120, it means this, and when it's 60, it means that, that kind of thing.
Which you can already see in some of the wearables, very basic wearables such as watches or rings, where from one person to the other, for the exact same heart rate, it will not give you the same interpretation because it has this calibration period.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And I think that's very, very important. And you can really tell how one way to tell whether a device is well produced, maybe, or well, is whether how well they do the calibration um, and how well they correct for errors. For example, I have a wrist-based device that often tells me that my heart rate is, I don't know, 180 or something, which would be almost impossible, given that I'm sitting down and it's just the algorithm probably having running into certain errors. No, and that kind of thing can, I think, reduce the user confidence if you keep getting notifications that have not so much, to do with reality. I think that for the consumer, that kind of thing is important to fix. Yeah.
So, talking about the devices, there are
Hmm.
so many different wearables, IoT, AR, VR glasses, headsets, and so on, and even direct chips into the brain in a
Right.
couple of years.
Right.
How do you evaluate them from your perspective with your background, and what should consumers and also professionals in the healthcare space look for when using these devices?
Well, I think it depends on the application. So, for example, if I'm getting a device just for me to monitor how many steps I take, I'm not going to be as picky as if I was trying to find a 32-channel EEG to work with in the lab. So, obviously, there's this. It depends on expectations. I think there is often at least for clinical trials or even just pilot studies, it makes sense to look in the scientific literature, because there's often a lot of, if a clinician is looking for a device for his or her use case, I would suggests I would suggest looking at the literature, because there's a lot of comparisons out there, comparison studies between gold standards. For example, if I was looking at sleep quality, a gold standard device that monitors sleep in a sleep lab with, say, my Fitbit. There are a lot of these kind of comparative studies that I think are very useful. And then apart from that, also just trying things out. And then oftentimes, even in daily use, we're all very intelligent people, I think very sophisticated in terms of use of technology. And we know when something, it just doesn't make sense. I stayed awake half the night, but my sleep tracker says that I had the best sleep ever. How could that possibly be? Yeah. So I think just this kind of common sense matching of actual self-reported experience. I mean, that is self-reporting. When you note your own observations and compare it with a device that you're doing basically what we do in the lab, but maybe without all the statistics. And also, there are things like looking at the specifications of a device. Does it have specifications? Does those specifications have error estimates? If you're looking for a clinical device or a consumer device, at least a range that looks reasonable. And that kind of thing. So I think there are lots of ways to check, but ultimately it also comes down to experience. I know a lot of people have already noticed, for example, that if I just wave my arm around, my smartwatch thinks I'm walking and starts counting steps. And those things, of course, sometimes they can't be helped, because they're just the limitations of having a couple of sensors running on low energy on the end of your arm, and it has to somehow try to predict like what your whole body is doing. And that's you also have to have some kind of expectation management, I think. Like how much can that really do? Although I would say that a device that consistently gives bad data is maybe worse than nothing, because it just confuses the heck out of the user, right? It's like, well, what is this? So sometimes no information is better than completely inaccurate information. There we have to be a bit careful. Yeah.
Well, that will be the bottom line for our conversation. Thank you so much.
Great.
I think that was a very pragmatic and realistic approach to this whole field and all the buzz around it. So thank you so much for taking the time to break everything down.
You're welcome, Anca.
And that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I will see you soon for another adventure in health tech.